So hello everyone, welcome to my lightning talk about dark mode. And of course that means my presentation should be in dark mode as well, so let's get started. And when I talk about dark mode, I'm talking about your application that you provide your users with a dark mode theme. But of course the opposite applies as well. So if you have a dark theme website now, make sure you also provide a light theme to your users. And we can do this by detecting the color scheme of the user's operating system, which nowadays on major operating systems can be categorized as either a light theme or a dark theme. And many applications do this already, both on the web, but also your mobile applications on your phone. And the number is only going up. So the longer you hold off, the more you become the odd one out. Because for many people, dark mode is simply a preference, and that's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with saying I like the dark mode or the light mode, but for some people, it's actually an accessibility necessity. And it can be pretty simple, such as working outside in the sun and you have a lot of direct sunlight on your screen. And even with the brightness settings to the top, you might not be able to see very well. But also the opposite, so maybe you are in a dark environment and even with a low brightness, it could still strain your eyes. But for some people, it can go a little bit further. It can be more important. For example, for some people, they use a dark theme because it's easier on the eyes and it might actually lower the chances of suffering from migraines. So there can be many reasons why a person would prefer one theme over the other. And what we can do when building an application is to go along with the color scheme of the user's operating system using prefers color scheme. And prefers color scheme is a CSS media feature that when implemented can look like this. So here we detect that the user has a dark operating system theme, so we also set a dark background color. And of course, we can also do the same thing for a light theme. So if the user has a light theme, we will set a white background color. And browser support is pretty good. All major browsers support it. Of course, IE11 is clueless, no surprise there, but otherwise it's very well supported. So how to get started with this? First of all, in case you were thinking of it, do not go with separate style sheets for each theme. You don't really want to be maintaining that. So instead, go for variables and ideally CSS variables. And if you haven't really used CSS variables before, this is what it looks like. So here we have an element that uses variables to implement a font color and background color. And it doesn't really have any knowledge of what the actual values are. Instead, it just uses the variables that it inherits from a parent element in the DOM. And the creation of a variable looks like this. So here we create a variable on the root, which is the HTML element, so that all children have access to this variable. And below, we can then override the variable to a dark color if the user has a dark themed operating system. And next up, tell the browser that you support different themes, which can be done via a CSS property and even a meta tag in your HTML head if you want. And this tells the browser that it can also follow the operating system theme to help you out. For example, it will properly style native elements such as buttons and inputs. Maybe you don't have them anymore. Maybe you have a design system, but it can also change the default background color when you refresh. So sometimes the color is white, but if you have a dark theme, then it can also make it a darker color. And who knows what's going to happen in the future when this becomes more and more used. So browser support for this is pretty decent. Firefox is lagging behind a little bit at the moment, but otherwise it's doing pretty okay so far. And yeah, so far, so detecting what we're doing so far is pretty good based on the operating system theme, but the user should still remain in control. And what that means is allow them to adjust their settings. Because maybe for whatever reason, regardless of how they set their operating system, they might still prefer a light or dark theme of your website. So by default, you can detect their theme, but give them the option to change it if they want. And that means you have to store their preference. So it can be in a cookie, it can be in local storage, or perhaps even in a database if you want to save it across devices. Now, letting the user set a theme might create a little bit of a challenge here, because how do you use the CSS media queries in this case? For example, our CSS media query could be detecting a dark theme and then implement dark variables, but maybe the user selected a light theme. And obviously, we want the user's preference to take priority over the CSS media query. And at this point, we could use the help of JavaScript for this. So like all CSS media queries, we can also check them with JavaScript using the match media function. And you could put this in a function to see if the media query matches. And based on that, we know if the user is in a dark themed operating system or not. And you could also combine this function with getting the user's preference and let their preference override the result of this current function. And then you will always know what theme your website should be. And what that logic would let you do, for example, is to set a top level attribute in your DOM that sets the applicable theme. Then you can create your dark mode variable based on the presence of the attribute rather than in a CSS media query. And it is understandable you might want to stick to CSS media queries to basically just stick to a CSS only solution. But yeah, you'll probably introduce a lot of complexity in maybe a less obvious place in regards to dynamically altering your CSS or something like that. But then you'll still need some JavaScript to basically deal with the user preference. Now moving on to maybe another challenge, which is when you want to implement dark theme on a big project, because maybe your application contains many features maintained by many different teams. So how are you going to introduce another theme? So do you have a single release train where everyone is going to implement their changes and onboard the release? Or can everyone release independently, and is everyone going live on the same agreed upon date and time? So these options don't really seem great. Also, when everyone, when is everyone going to work on this exactly? Like not all teams work at the same speed, and some features are more complex than others, and maybe some teams don't have time right now. So the strategy suggestion for this is to do not go for a big bang, but rather set the theme on an app level and allow features to get the theme. And this kind of is already the approach we were following in this talk, because we set the variables on an app level and the features simply inherit the variables. Now, to prepare for implementing your dark mode in a bigger project is to start out by hard coding your current theme and by exposing relevant CSS variables. And each feature team can start replacing their current values with the actual theme variables. And this can all go to production in the meantime, because ultimately the values are the same. They're just now variables, right? And when all teams are ready to go live with your dark mode, simply use that piece of JavaScript from earlier to detect the user's operating system theme, or of course their preference, and use that to make the theme attribute dynamic, after which you'd be effectively going live with your dark mode. But how can a component figure out what the current theme is? Now, this might not be necessary because you're using variables that might do all the heavy work. And components usually don't need any more specific knowledge. But what if your component needs to implement a very specific override for dark mode only, such as maybe an additional spacing or whatever? And you cannot really create a generic variable for it because it's really specific to your use case. And I actually have an example of that in a later slide. But even though we have a top-level attribute that tells us what the current theme is, there are many ways libraries and frameworks implement encapsulation, such as shadow DOM and scope styles. And all of that might prevent the component from accessing that top-level attribute. So it can still be a good idea to have a way for components to detect the current theme. And in the end, it's about informing your components what's going on. And there are many ways to do that. So just go with whatever works well for your stack. It can be JavaScript variables, you can be passing down properties, or you can use a shared module. And I think a shared module, such as this example, would be great for that. So here we have two functions. So the first function sets the color scheme, and this function can be used by the application. So the application can just set it to light or dark, and components could import this as well. Use the second function to reliably get what the current theme actually is. And that way, a component could do something specific for dark mode only. And that was pretty much most of the technical stuff that I wanted to share. But there's one more important thing when it comes to implementing a new theme, whether it's a dark theme or a light theme, which is that you really have to design it. So it will not be good enough to simply invert your colors and be done with it. And there are many things a designer should look at to see if it requires any adjustments. So maybe your font needs to be slightly thicker when it's inverted, and probably shadows won't look as good on dark mode. Maybe they need to be a little bit stronger now that the background is darker as well, just so that they can stand out a little bit more. But also images can be quite interesting, because on a light theme, images can look great, but when the background is suddenly dark, then the same images can be overwhelming. So a common trick is to tone down the images with CSS to optimize them for a darker background. But an even better way is to actually serve different images, so to have actually optimized images for each theme. But designing your dark mode, figuring out what needs to be done, what needs to be tweaked, is really up to your designers. If you have them, of course. Otherwise, I guess it's all up to you. In which case, I say enjoy and have fun. And that's it. So thanks for listening.